here we go. All right, so I think we left off with the election of 1860. I think that's where we left off with the big group, right? The election of 1860. So the election of 1860 is where Abraham Lincoln is elected. Abraham Lincoln's elected, perhaps our greatest president of all time, probably our greatest president of all time. He's certainly who I would put as our number one. He is the first president that we have that's elected on an explicitly anti-slavery platform. Okay, he rises to prominence. He becomes famous for being anti-slavery, right? So he's our first really anti-slavery president. We've had some presidents who were kind of against slavery a little bit here and there, right? Jefferson would talk against slavery once in a while, but then he also owned 190 people. You know, like we would, and prior to Lincoln, the last like 7 or 8 presidents we've had have all been like slave owners or pro-slavery. Like we haven't really had any anti-slavery presidents since like Adams, right? John Quincy Adams and his son were both anti-slavery, and that's about it. Okay, so the election of Lincoln is the final straw in the secession movement, because the election of Lincoln prompts South Carolina to leave. Lincoln is elected in November of 60. South Carolina is out by December of 60. Okay, they're gone by December of 60. By January of 61, all of these states are gone too. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, right? They're all gone by January. At this time period, the president is inaugurated in March, right? So before Lincoln even swears in, he's already down. He's already minus 7 states. Okay, it's all these green states on here, right? The Confederacy gets formed by the time Lincoln is inaugurated. He's inaugurated in March. In April. In April, Lincoln is going to get our first battle, our first fight, and then immediately following that, the next 4 states are all going to leave as well. Okay, so by the end of April of 1861, all of these pink states plus green states are all gone. All right, so what's going on with these dark purple states? We need to spend a moment with these dark purple states. These dark purple states are the slave states that stay loyal to the Union. Slave states that stay loyal to the Union. So Missouri and Kentucky both hold votes. They both hold votes to leave, and they barely vote to stay. They both barely vote to stay. They both like 51% votes to stay in the country for both Missouri and Kentucky. Maryland is a different case. Lincoln does something very controversial. He violates habeas corpus. He violates habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, I can spell it for you real quick. If I can pull up the chat. Where's the chat? If it will let me pull up the chat. He violates habeas corpus. Oh, you dummy. Okay, so he violates habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the come on. Zoom, why you got to be so dumb? Why you got to be so stupid, Zoom? All right. Okay, so habeas corpus is the law that says that the military can never be used as law enforcement. There's a distinction between civilian law enforcement and military, that you cannot use the military to occupy an American state, and that you can't use the military to enforce laws. Lincoln violates this. He uses the military to basically seize Maryland. He basically invades Maryland before Maryland can even vote. And he goes to all of the Maryland politicians in the legislature and the governor, and he says, if you vote to secede, I'm going to throw you in jail. You cannot do this. And he basically goes to their homes and arrests them. He arrests them and he tells them, he says, if you vote to stay, I will let you out of jail. Essentially, is what he does. This is a pretty like drastic step. Why is Lincoln so concerned about Maryland? Why is he doing this really drastic step?
Is it close to the capital?
Yeah, exactly. The capital is like right here. If you see where my red dot is, that's the capital. If Maryland leaves, DC is screwed, right? Washington, DC is screwed because then it's surrounded by the Confederacy. Maryland is by far and away the most important state that Lincoln absolutely has to hold on to. Otherwise, we're done. The whole country's done. Okay, so he does this. This becomes pretty controversial though, right? Because you can't just violate habeas corpus. You can't just like arrest people. You can't just like force them to not hold a vote, right? That's not very democratic. It's not very democratic. And Lincoln's own Secretary of State, Seward, he says to Lincoln, he says, hey, this is illegal. You can't do this. And Lincoln just says to him, he says, look, he says, I will agree to stand trial after this is over. And if the judges deem that I am guilty and that I should go to jail, then I will go to jail. He basically just says, we're going to let the judges figure it out. And Lincoln knows that it's illegal, but he also knows that it's so important that he has no choice, basically. The question becomes, would Maryland have gotten out? And the answer is maybe. Maryland is this kind of weird case where it has slaves, but Maryland also has a pretty large population of free Black people as well, right? It's right next to Pennsylvania. It has a lot of influence coming in from the abolitionists, right? Like, so Marylanders for decades now have been like dying and leaving in their wills that their slaves are free and stuff like that, right? So it's not totally clear that Maryland would have voted to leave. That's not totally clear. But Lincoln wasn't going to roll that die, right? He's not rolling the die. He's just locking it down right away. Okay. All right. Let's go to our next big number. Is that T? All right. Big number T, Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter and the war begins. Put Civil War begins and then draw some explosions next to it. Civil War begins, draw some explosions. All right. So Fort Sumter is in South Carolina, and it's a naval fort on the coast of South Carolina. Lincoln does not recognize that South Carolina has seceded. He doesn't recognize that as legal. So what Lincoln does is he sends a ship into Fort Sumter to resupply the fort. This is a standard scheduled resupply mission, and he sends them in. He sends them in to go resupply. The Southerners are down there and they say, if your ship enters our fort, then we're going to treat it as an invasion and we're going to fire on you. The Union ship, the Northern ship, says, no, we're not invading you. You're part of the United States. We're just here to bring you supplies. So the Southerners say, you've been warned. The ship moves forward, the Southerners fire on the ship, and so the ship opens fire on the fort, and we're off. We're off to the races. Okay, so this is considered the beginning of our war. And from this point forward, we're going to be in this war. From this point forward, the South is going to be losing. They will never be winning in the war. There's a couple of battles that they start to win in the beginning. The South does have a couple of victories here and there, but they're never going to be winning the war. They really aren't. Okay. If you've done your assignment already about why the North won, then you should figure out pretty quickly that the North has advantages in basically every category, right? Basically every single category, the North has advantages, and the North has massive advantages. Okay, so let's deal with our military advantage first. okay? The military advantage of the North is that the Army is like 3 times larger than the South, okay? The Army is so big. The Northern Army is so big. The population of the North is much, much, much larger than the South, and the population of the North is able to just recruit soldiers forever, right? For days, they can just recruit soldiers. Okay. If you add just the Army from like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, just those 4 states alone outnumber the South. And that's not even including all the other states, right? So this is the North has just so many soldiers. The North also has all the factories. They have all the factories to make guns, to make cannons, to make boots and food and clothes and everything they need. So very early on, it kind of looks like the South is going to win because the South kind of wins a couple of little battles. But we, looking on it now, can tell that the South really was at no point winning. Not really. All right. Um, one of the best examples of this is the Battle of Vicksburg. So the Battle of Vicksburg is over here. It's in Mississippi. It's in Mississippi. It's on the Mississippi River. And the Battle of Vicksburg is where we're first going to meet the great hero of the war, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, he's from Ohio. He's from Ohio, and he had grown up as an abolitionist. Even as a child, he was a member of the Underground Railroad. And the school that he was at when he was a kid used to take in slaves that had escaped out of Kentucky into Ohio, and he would tend to the slaves and give them food and give them supplies and then help them go on their way. He was raised in that environment. He was raised doing that. And he was opposed to slavery his entire life. Um, he failed at business over and over again, and then he joined the army. He's part of the army when they invaded Mexico. He was part of the army that took Mexico City, right? Which is where he kind of rose to power a little bit. But it's not until the Civil War that he really, really shines. His commanding officer gets killed. He takes over, and he just kicks butt and takes names. Okay, Ulysses Grant is going to be the greatest hero of the war. He is going to also rise up and become the commander of all of the Northern forces, and he will eventually become president as well. He is by far and away the biggest hero of the war. And he wins for a couple of reasons. First, his army is massive, right? But the second reason why he wins is because he's the first really big name to arm former slaves. As he starts moving through the South, every time they come to a plantation, he frees the slaves and he tells the slaves, "You are free to go, but I would appreciate it if you helped me free your brethren." Some of the slaves leave, and many of them choose to stay. By the time we get to Grant seizing New Orleans, in the siege of New Orleans, Grant has with him 150,000 former slaves. He basically doubled his army. He basically doubled his army just with former slaves. And these are former slaves that have guns, they have weapons, they're training them as they go, they're training them on how to march. They're not as well supplied or well trained as the whites, but there's 150,000 of them, right? So, the number is more important than the training. From day one, Grant looks at this as a war about slavery. From day one. A lot of the generals don't, right? Like you have to remember that for a lot of Americans, are like opposed to slavery, but they don't really care that much, right? They're more inclined to say something like, "I'm not really political. It's not really my thing. I'm not really into it. The Negro problem is a Southern problem, right? Me here in New York, that's just not what I care about, right?" Grant is not one of those people. From day one, Grant looks at this as a war on slavery. Okay. This is also one of the reasons why Grant is going to rise to prominence because he completely agrees with Lincoln, right? Lincoln and Grant both agree that this is an anti-slavery war, that this is a war to end slavery. And so Grant is going to rise to prominence because of this. Before I make you think that Grant is some kind of superhero, we need to point out that he does have one major flaw. His major flaw is that he is an alcoholic. He's an out of control alcoholic in a lot of ways. And he will oftentimes go for days on end with blackouts where he just can't, he's so drunk he can't even understand anything. He can't even think anything. In fact, there's one of the battles where he passes out in the battle and his men put him into one of the tents and they cover for him. And he wins the battle even though he's passed out in the tent. Okay. This is going to be a problem and it's going to come back when he becomes president. It is a problem, but I'm going to point it out to you now. It's not a problem big enough for him to lose the war. He's going to win. He's going to win and he's going to win big. Okay. He's oftentimes cited as like not being a super brilliant tactician, but he wins basically every battle. So he can't be that bad. Right? Okay. The next big battle is the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam. I'm not giving you a ton of battles. I'm just going to give you a couple of them. You don't need all of these. The Battle of Antietam, it's in Maryland. It happens in Maryland. The Battle of Antietam is the first time that we really get to see a lot of the big Southern names, like Robert E. Lee. I'm sure you've heard of him already before. Robert E. Lee is the Southern guy. A lot of Southern people will oftentimes try to convince me that Robert E. Lee is like a great, like, sorry, I got something in my throat. Southern people will oftentimes try to convince me that Robert E. Lee is like one of the greatest military tacticians the United States has ever seen and stuff, right? I would like to point out that, first of all, the South does have a lot of very skilled generals. Lee is probably the most skilled general, but Stonewall Jackson and a couple of these other guys are really skilled. I would like to point out that A, they lost. So, there's that. And B, they're traitors. Let's be clear here. Robert E. Lee is a skilled general who is a traitor to his country, taking up arms and murdering loyal American soldiers. I'm sorry, he's a traitor, right? I was in the Air Force, I was in the military, I served for 8 years, and I guarantee that if we had a traitor in our unit, we would not be calling him a hero. We would put him in jail because he's a traitor. That's what you do to traitors. Okay? So you're not gonna see me praising these Southern guys because they don't deserve to be praised. Right? They're traitors defending slavery. They are wrong. All right, so the heroes of the battle: George McClellan, the northern soldier general in charge. He's our great hero. Ambrose Burnside is not very important, except look at that facial hair. How could I pass him up? Look at that. Whew, that's pretty good, right? Shiva knows what I'm talking about, right? She was like, he could get some. I get it. We all get it, Shiva. Eric was thinking the same thing. We get it. Burnside is mostly important because of those glorious sideburns. He's the reason why we call them sideburns. Because he's so famous, this is where the term sideburns come from. So it's not important for US history. I just kind of feel like it's a little tidbit for you guys. Okay? All right. So Antietam stands out as the bloodiest single day in the war's history. Okay? 12,000 Union soldiers die, 10,000 Confederate soldiers die. The Union wins because the Union still has more soldiers left over, but this is the bloodiest single one day in the war's history. We need to respect for a moment what's happening in this country at this time. Okay? The US Civil War kills more Americans than all other American wars combined. Okay? All other American wars combined. Antietam kills 22,000 Americans in one day. And it's not the biggest battle. We're going to get bigger battles that are worse. And scenes like this are going to become commonplace around the country. mass graves with huge numbers of soldiers dead, that they just bury them because they have to bury them. Okay? For every soldier who dies in battle, 10 die from disease. For every soldier who dies in battle, 10 die from disease. And many of those soldiers dying from disease are not even in the battle. They're just dying as they like travel to the next battle, as they are traveling or stuff like that. Cholera and dysentery are raging through the populations of these soldiers. Okay. This is incredibly bloody, incredibly nasty. Okay. Images like this is also one of the first battles this is one of the first wars in human history to be fought after the invention of the camera. Okay, it's not the first. The Crimean War in Europe was the first, but this is like the second war. So we have pictures of the war. All right, let's do the Emancipation Proclamation. Next. All right. So the Emancipation Proclamation is Abraham Lincoln's executive order where he says that all of the slaves in rebellion states are freed. He declares that all the states in the rebellious states are free. So, what's missing with that proclamation?
Like Kentucky and Maryland slaves?
I can't hear you, Chief.
Maryland slaves and like Kentucky.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, right? You need to know he does not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay, what's the other problem with that? So one, he doesn't free the slaves that are in the North. What's the other problem?
Does the South recognize it?
Yeah, that's the other problem. Does this proclamation actually free the slaves in Texas? Is it like a Texas plantation owner was sitting around and then he gets the memo and he's like, oh, I guess you guys are free now, I guess. And he just opens the gate? No, right? The plantation in Louisiana opens its gate because the owner of the plantation has a bullet in his head and the soldier opens the gate, right? The generals are freeing the slaves, the South isn't. But what this means is that the generals cannot hold slaves. The generals must leave it open, okay? The Emancipation Proclamation is important. It's one of these things that shows up on tests a lot of times where they'll say, what's the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation? The number one most commonly wrong answer is it freed the slaves. It didn't. It didn't free the slaves in any real way. It didn't free them, right? What's important is it kind of rebrands the war so that everybody understands that the war is about slavery. From Lincoln, from day one, this was about slavery. For all the decision makers, for Jefferson Davis, for Lincoln, for Ulysses Grant, for Robert E. Lee, for all these decision makers, from day one, it was about slavery. But for the average Joe, like the average guy, living in New York or Ohio or something, it may not be about slavery, right? Average farmer guy in Michigan will be like, I don't know, slavery is not really my fight. Now we understand it is. Okay. Seward is going to criticize Lincoln for this Emancipation Proclamation, and he says to the reporter one time, and he says, this is a perfect example of what America thinks about its slaves, is that for the slaves that we're holding, we do nothing, but for the slaves that we can't touch, we say that they're free. Right? Which is a pretty accurate criticism, I would say. It's a pretty accurate criticism. Which leads us into your guys' discussion this week. Your discussion this week is from this book. It's from Doris Kearns Goodwin, her book Team of Rivals, which is a Pulitzer Prize book about the Civil War. Doris Kearns Goodwin is one of the most prominent historians in America today. and I just copied a chapter out of her book. I copied the chapter on the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination. It's long. I'm going to warn you now, it's about 40 pages. So it is long, but it's really good. It's really good. There's a reason why she's won the Pulitzer multiple times, that she's like fantastic. So it's really good. Because teachers always tell you that and students oftentimes don't believe it, I'm going to also say B, it's not due this Sunday. I made it due next Friday. So you have extra time to work on it, okay? Does that seem fair? I stand by the choice. I know that it's a little bit long, but I think it's really good. It's really good. I think it's worth it. Okay? So, all right, back to this. Let's keep fighting our war. All right, the Battle of Gettysburg over here, focus on this part. The Battle of Gettysburg is our next big battle that we need to know about. Happens in July of 1863. July of 1863, it happens over the course of a couple of days, over 3 days. This is the bloodiest battle in all of American history. It's the bloodiest battle in all of American history. Okay. It's in Pennsylvania. It's also the only yeah. All right, so it's the bloodiest battle in all of American history. It kills more than 50,000 people. 50,000 men die. And there are so many bodies in this war. So many bodies in this war that the women of Gettysburg, who are digging the graves and gathering the bodies, they very famously write in their in like some articles and stuff where they say that there are so many bodies that they can't protect them, that pigs are coming and eating the bodies, and that they have to take half the women who are like digging the graves, half these women they have to take them off of digging duty and take them on pig defense duty. And so the women are trying to fight off the pigs as the pigs are starting to eat the bodies. It gets to a point where the women can't save all the bodies, that they gather the Union bodies and defend the bodies, and they let the Southern bodies be eaten by pigs. Right? People, bad history teachers will oftentimes tell you that there's no women in the wars, right? And the women, I am giving you a lot of men in this section of the class, right? Because the men are the soldiers. But we have to understand that the women are in the support roles. The women are doing all the medical work. The women are cooking the food for the men. The women are sewing the uniforms. The women are working the factories. And the women are burying the dead, right? Just because the women aren't carrying guns doesn't mean that they're gone. It's not like half the country just disappeared, right? They load all the ladies up onto a ship and say, okay, you guys go off onto Lady Island for a while, right? That didn't happen. Okay, the women are still there. And it's not like the women are just sitting at home waiting for the war to be over. And they're like, oh, gee, if only I was a man, I would do something. Like, that's stupid. That's not happening either. Okay, so the women are involved. They're just doing all this support work. This is the most famous picture of Gettysburg, called Harvest of Death by Alexander Gardner. He's the photographer. As the Southern Army retreats, Robert E. Lee's army retreats, as they retreat, they come upon a group of black freed slaves, and they re-enslave them. They re-enslave like 400 black people and drive them into the South again, back into slavery, shooting and killing and beating them as they go. In case you forgot for a moment that the war is about slavery or not, look at what the Southern priority is as they're escaping with their lives. While the North is chasing them, the South has enough time to re-enslave hundreds of black people. Right? If anyone tells you that this is not about slavery, you can just cite this. All right, Gettysburg is famous for A, being the bloodiest battle, but B, the Gettysburg Address. And this is where Lincoln is right here. This is Lincoln. That's him in the picture, giving the address. He has a beard now for the first time in his life. For all of his life, he was clean shaven. He only had a beard for the last 2 years of his life. The depression of the war, the beard represented his depression of the war, right? As he was in the dark days, he suffered from depression oftentimes. And in the dark days of the war, he grew his beard. It's interesting because we all have him in our memory as him with a beard, right? But he doesn't for most of his life. He doesn't. All right, here's our Gettysburg Address. All right, Anika, can you read it for us?
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
That's pretty dang good. Pretty dang good. Abraham Lincoln address. He gives the Gettysburg Address at the site of Gettysburg in November after the battle, and he delivers probably the most famous, greatest speech in all of American history. And look how short it is. It's short enough to fit on one slide, right? So, students always ask me, how long does my paper have to be? And I always tell them the Gettysburg Address is only 180 words. All you have to do is be as good as Lincoln, you know. And but it's some kind of mixture between politics and poetry, right? The war is coming to an end. Let's come to an end real quick. Let's wrap this up. By 1864, if you look at our map here, by 1863, 1864, you can see the Union is basically just mopping up the South, right? The Navy is taking over the coast, and the Union Army is just running its way all the way through. Okay. Grant is up here fighting with Lee up in this area, and Sherman is going to seize Atlanta and then move his way to the sea. General Sherman right here is going to go down as Southerners are going to curse his name forever as a great villain of the war. He seizes Atlanta. He takes the largest city of the South, and then he proceeds to march to the sea. As he marches to the sea, Sherman burns down every building, every plantation, everything he finds across the entire state of Georgia. He burns it to the ground. He rips up the railroads, tears down the buildings, and he burns it all of it. This, some people would say, is overkill. He probably doesn't need to do this, but at this point in time, the war has been going on for 4 years, and the war has been going on for almost 5 years. The war has become a long, bloody, nasty affair. Hundreds of thousands of men are dead. Hundreds of thousands of men are dead across the country, and Sherman has a taste for carnage. The war ends at Appomattox, the Battle of Appomattox, at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Ulysses Grant takes the surrender of Robert E. Lee, and the war is over in April of 1865. All right. Do you guys have questions about this war? The North definitively won, like it wasn't even close. Okay. Have you guys finished the assignment yet? The assignment, the Why the North Won assignment, right? In the case of Anika, she hasn't even started yet. Yeah. Am I wrong? Okay. All right. Go through those categories. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. The North has the advantage in all of the categories. Spoiler, right? This isn't even close. A lot of times people are going to try to argue that the South could have won, right? But I cannot see any way that the South could have won, right? The South is just outnumbered. There's more factories, there's more railroads, there's more transportation, there's more soldiers, there's more everything. The North just has more of everything, right? Plus the North is drawing from an entire frontier, right? The South invaded the North one time, and that was Gettysburg, and the South lost, right? Like it just isn't, the South just wasn't even close. It just wasn't even close, okay? All right, you guys have a quiz. You guys have a quiz. I want you to log in and take the quiz today. The quiz is 4.2, I think. Is that right? 4.2. 4.2, it's on the Dred Scott court case. And the code is candy cane, all lowercase with a space. Cool? All right. Do you guys have questions about the war? All right. I want you to be ready for your test next week. The essay question on your test is going to be about the causes of the war. Okay. So your question will come in the format where it'll say something along the lines of, describe the economic factors that led to the Civil War, or describe the political factors, or describe the judicial factors, or describe the cultural factors that led to the Civil War, right? Your question is going to be one of those, something like that, okay? It's a very, very common question for the AP exam, okay? They almost always ask you questions about political, economic, social, and cultural, right? That's like what they always ask about, right? Very, very common. Okay, and they'll say something along the line of, what economic factors led to the outbreak of the Civil War, or something like that. So your essay will be something along those lines as well. Cool? All right, so you need to, we did an exercise in class today where the students had to come up with 8 causes of the Civil War, and we did that. It's really hard to do with you guys online. So maybe I'll see if we can do it as a discussion next time, next class period. Okay? All right. Do you guys have questions or problems or comments? Going once, going twice? All right. In that case, if